My name is Margaret. I'm 72 years old, and nothing in my long life prepared me for the pain I felt at that family dinner. 72 years of breathing, of loving, of watching children grow, of believing in the goodness of family, and in one horrific moment, all of that faith was shattered like glass hitting concrete. I've lived through wars on television, through economic crashes, through the death of my husband, through raising 3 children as a single mother when their father walked out. I thought I had seen the worst that life could throw at a person. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Because nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares you for the moment when you realize that evil can wear the face of someone you welcomed into your family with open arms. The rage I feel right now as I speak these words to you is like molten lava in my chest. It burns through my ribcage, it scorches my throat, and it makes my hands shake with fury that I've never experienced before. But underneath that rage is something even worse, a pain so deep, so cutting, that it feels like someone took a rusty knife and carved out pieces of my soul. When I walked into that house 3 weeks ago, carrying homemade lasagna and fresh bread rolls, expecting to see my granddaughter's beautiful face light up the way it always did when Grandma arrived, I never imagined that I would witness the most devastating act of cruelty I've ever seen in my life. My 8-year-old granddaughter, my precious Emma, was sitting at that dinner table with her head completely shaved. Not trimmed. Not styled. Shaved. Bald as an egg, with angry red razor burns across her scalp. And when that monster, because that's what she is, a monster wearing the mask of a mother, when she looked at my horror-stricken face and said with a casual shrug, "It's just a joke, Margaret." Don't be so dramatic. I felt something inside me die. Just die. Right there at that table. But the knife twisted deeper when my own son, my own flesh and blood, the boy I carried for 9 months and raised with every ounce of love I had, looked me in the eye and said, "Stop being dramatic, Mom. It's just hair. It'll grow back." In that moment, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Not cracked. Not broken. Shattered. Because I realized that my granddaughter's dignity, her sense of self, her basic human worth, had been stolen in front of everyone, and the people who were supposed to protect her were laughing about it. Before I continue with this story that's going to make your blood boil and your heart break, take a second to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and comment where you're watching from: Lagos, New York, Toronto, Sydney, wherever you are in this world. I want to know where hearts around the world are listening to this story, because what happened to my granddaughter could happen to any child, anywhere, and we need to stand together against this kind of cruelty. We need to be a voice for the voiceless. You have to understand what I was expecting when I arrived at my son David's house that evening. I had spent the entire afternoon cooking Emma's favorite meal, my grandmother's lasagna recipe with extra cheese, the way she likes it, and those soft dinner rolls that she always tears into little pieces and dips in butter. I was carrying bags full of love, essentially. Food made with my arthritic hands because making her happy makes me happy. I was expecting what I always expected when I visited, Emma running to the door, her long, beautiful auburn hair bouncing as she jumped into my arms, chattering about school and friends and whatever 8-year-old adventure she'd been on that week. I was expecting warmth, laughter, the sound of her voice asking me to braid her hair or put it in ponytails with those little butterfly clips she loves so much. Instead, when I walked through that door, I found silence. Terrible, suffocating silence. Emma was sitting at the dinner table, but she wasn't the child I knew. She was hunched over, shoulders curved inward like she was trying to disappear, wearing a baseball cap pulled down so low I could barely see her face. She didn't run to greet me. She didn't even look up. My heart started pounding immediately. Grandmother's instinct, you know? When something is wrong with your grandchild, every cell in your body screams danger. I set down the food and walked over to her, and that's when I saw them, her little hands, trembling like autumn leaves in the wind. Trembling with shame and fear. "Emma, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down beside her chair. "Grandma's here." "What's wrong, baby?" She finally looked up at me, and the pain in her eyes was like looking into the depths of hell. Pure, innocent pain that no child should ever carry. Her voice was barely a whisper when she said, "Grandma, Mommy says I look ugly now. She says I look like a boy and that maybe people will think I'm sick." My hands were shaking as I reached for that baseball cap, but before I could touch it, that woman, I can't even call her by name right now because it makes me too angry. She snatched the cap off Emma's head herself, like she was unveiling some kind of twisted masterpiece. What I saw underneath that cap will haunt me until the day I die. My granddaughter's beautiful hair that she had been growing for 2 years because she wanted to donate it to children with cancer, was gone. Not cut short, not trimmed, but shaved completely off with what must have been clippers or a razor. Her scalp was covered in tiny cuts and razor burn, red and irritated and clearly painful. Some spots were bleeding slightly. The sound that came out of my throat wasn't human. It was the cry of a wounded animal, of a grandmother watching her grandchild's humanity being stripped away. Emma immediately started crying, thinking I was upset with her, thinking she had done something wrong. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she sobbed. "I'm sorry I'm ugly now. I'm sorry Mommy had to make me look like this because I was bad. Had to make her look like this because she was bad." Those words are burned into my brain like a brand. Because that's when I understood that this wasn't an accident, wasn't a mistake, wasn't some misguided attempt at a cute haircut. This was punishment. This was deliberate humiliation of a child. The rage that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I've ever experienced. It was white-hot, consuming, the kind of anger that makes you understand how people can lift cars off trapped children or tear down walls with their bare hands. I wanted to scream until my lungs burst. I wanted to shake that woman until her teeth rattled. I wanted to gather my granddaughter up and run as far away as possible from these people who had hurt her. But I also felt something else, a crushing weight of guilt and failure. Because where was I when this happened? Why didn't I see the signs? Why didn't I protect her? What kind of grandmother lets this happen to their grandchild? I stood up from beside Emma's chair, my legs shaking with fury, and I looked directly at my daughter-in-law. Rebecca was standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, watching my reaction with what I can only describe as amusement. Amusement. Like my granddaughter's pain and my horror were entertaining to her. "What did you do to her?" I demanded, and my voice was so low and dangerous that even I didn't recognize it. "What did you do to my granddaughter?" Rebecca had the audacity to roll her eyes. Actually roll her eyes at me while my granddaughter sat there bold and humiliated. "Oh, please, Margaret. Don't be so dramatic. It's just hair. It's a modern style. Lots of girls have short hair now. Modern style." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Rebecca, you shaved off all of her hair. Her scalp is bleeding. Look at her. She's terrified." She was being difficult about getting ready for school, Rebecca said with a shrug that made me want to slap her. She wouldn't brush her hair properly, kept complaining about tangles. So I solved the problem. No more tangles, no more morning battles. It's practical. The casual way she said it, like she was talking about trimming hedges or organizing a closet, made my blood pressure spike so high I thought I might stroke out right there. This wasn't about practicality. This wasn't about solving a problem. This was about power, about control, about breaking a child's spirit. "You solved the problem?" I repeated, my voice getting louder. "By traumatizing an 8-year-old child? By humiliating her? By making her feel ugly and ashamed?" Emma started crying harder, and she reached for me with those little trembling hands. I pulled her against me, and she buried her face in my shoulder, her whole body shaking with sobs. I could feel the roughness of her shaved scalp against my neck, could feel the heat of those razor burns, and it made me want to commit violence. "It's also discipline," Rebecca continued, completely unmoved by her daughter's tears. "Maybe next time she'll listen when I tell her to take care of her appearance properly. Actions have consequences, Margaret. Maybe that's something your generation doesn't understand, but children need to learn that their choices matter." Her choices? What choices? The choice to be an 8-year-old child who gets tangles in her hair? The choice to need help with grooming because she's still learning? The choice to be human and imperfect? She's 8 years old. I shouted, and I didn't care who heard me. 8. She's supposed to have tangled hair and messy braids and grass stains on her clothes. She's supposed to be a child, not some perfectly groomed doll for you to control. Other family members started gathering around. David's younger brother Mark and his wife, Rebecca's sister, who was visiting for the week. I could see the shock on their faces, the uncomfortable shifting as they realized they were witnessing something terrible. But none of them said anything. None of them stood up for Emma. They just stood there like cowards, watching this unfold. Rebecca's face hardened, and for the first time, I saw the real her. Not the sweet, helpful daughter-in-law who brought casseroles to church potlucks and smiled at family photos. I saw the cold, calculating woman who could shave off a child's hair and call it discipline. "You need to mind your own business, Margaret," she said, her voice turning icy. "Emma is my daughter, not yours. How I choose to parent her is not your concern. If you don't like my methods, you're welcome to leave." Emma's grip on me tightened, and she whispered against my ear, "Please don't leave me, Grandma. Please don't go." The desperation in her voice broke something fundamental inside me. This child was begging me not to abandon her, clinging to me like I was her lifeline, and her own mother was standing there threatening to throw me out for objecting to child abuse. Because that's what this was. Child abuse. Not discipline, not practical problem solving, not modern parenting. This was psychological and emotional abuse designed to break a child's spirit and make her compliant through fear and shame. If you were sitting at that table, if you saw your granddaughter or niece or neighbor's child in this condition, would you stay silent or would you stand up? Would you choose peace and family harmony over a child's well-being? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because I need to know that there are still people in this world who would fight for the innocent. The betrayal I felt when my son David finally spoke up was like a second knife in my already bleeding heart. I had been waiting for him to step in, to protect his daughter, to be the man I raised him to be. When he finally opened his mouth, I thought he was going to defend Emma. I thought he was going to tell his wife that she had gone too far. Instead, he looked at me with exasperation and said, "Mom, it's just hair. It'll grow back. You're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be. Just hair. Just hair." Those words echoed in my mind like a death knell. This man, this person I carried in my womb, nursed at my breast, taught to ride a bicycle, helped with homework, celebrated every birthday and graduation and achievement. This man was dismissing his daughter's pain as insignificant. "David," I said, and my voice was shaking with disbelief. "Look at your daughter. Really look at her. She's traumatized. She's ashamed. She thinks she's ugly. How can you say this is just about hair?" He had the nerve to sigh, like I was being unreasonable. Like I was the problem. "Mom, kids are resilient. She'll get over it. Rebecca was just trying to teach her responsibility. Maybe if you supported us instead of undermining us, Emma would learn faster." Undermining them. I was undermining them by objecting to child abuse. I was being unsupportive by wanting my granddaughter to feel loved and valued instead of humiliated and ashamed. "I raised 3 children, David," I said, my voice rising again. 3 children, including you. I managed tangled hair and messy rooms and all the chaos that comes with raising kids. I never once felt the need to shave off anyone's hair as punishment. I never once made any of you feel ugly or ashamed of your appearance. Times were different then, he said dismissively. You were too soft. Kids nowadays need stronger boundaries. Too soft. I was too soft because I didn't psychologically abuse my children. I was too soft because I chose love over fear, encouragement over humiliation, teaching over punishment. Emma was still clinging to me, still crying into my shoulder, and I could feel her whole body trembling. My granddaughter, this innocent little girl who had never hurt anyone, who gave away half her Halloween candy every year to kids who couldn't afford costumes, who cried when she saw roadkill on the highway. This precious child was being treated like a criminal by the people who were supposed to love her most. David, listen to me, I said, trying to reach whatever was left of the son I raised. This isn't about hair. This is about Emma's sense of self-worth. It's about her feeling safe and loved in her own home. Look at her. She's terrified. She thinks she's ugly. Is that really what you want for your daughter? But he just shook his head, like I was speaking a foreign language. She needs to learn that actions have consequences. She needs to understand that when she doesn't take care of her things, there are results. This is good for her character development. Good for her character development. The character development of an 8-year-old child was being served by making her feel hideous and ashamed. The logic was so twisted, so fundamentally wrong, that I felt like I was arguing with aliens. Rebecca stepped closer to David, putting her hand on his arm in a show of unity. Your mother doesn't respect our parenting decisions, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She thinks she knows better than we do how to raise our own daughter. The manipulation in her voice was masterful. She was painting me as the interfering mother-in-law, the one who couldn't mind her own business, the one causing family drama. She was making herself and David the victims of my unreasonable demands that they not abuse their child. My granddaughter's tears were real, I said, my voice breaking with emotion. Her pain was real. Her shame was real. But to you, to both of you, her suffering is invisible. You've convinced yourselves that traumatizing a child is good parenting and that anyone who objects is the problem. The room fell silent except for Emma's quiet sobs. Everyone was looking at the floor, at their phones, anywhere but at the bald, crying child in my arms. The cowardice was breathtaking. Not one person in that room was willing to speak up for an innocent child. That's when I knew I had to get Emma out of there. I had to remove her from this environment where her pain was dismissed, where her dignity was considered unimportant, where the adults who were supposed to protect her were the ones hurting her. But I also knew that taking her would mean war with my own son. It would mean choosing my granddaughter over family peace, choosing what was right over what was easy. And despite the rage coursing through my veins, despite the pain of his betrayal, David was still my child. The decision to stand against him was tearing me apart from the inside. I couldn't stay in that house one more minute watching my granddaughter suffer while everyone pretended this was normal. I couldn't sit at that dinner table and eat lasagna while Emma sat there bald and humiliated, thinking she was ugly, thinking she deserved this treatment. Emma, sweetheart, I whispered into her ear. Grandma is going to take you home with me tonight. We're going to go to my house where you're safe. She pulled back to look at me, her eyes wide with hope and fear. Really? I can come with you. Yes, baby. Right now. But as I stood up, still holding Emma, Rebecca stepped in front of me. She's not going anywhere. She lives here. This is her home. This is not a home, I said, my voice deadly quiet. This is a place where children are abused and humiliated. Emma is coming with me. Like hell she is, Rebecca snapped. You have no rights here, Margaret. None. She's my daughter, and she stays where I say she stays. Emma started crying harder, clinging to me desperately. Please, Grandma. Please don't leave me here. I want to go with you. The sound of my granddaughter begging to be saved from her own mother was like listening to my heart being ripped out with rusty pliers. No child should have to beg for protection from the people who gave them life. David, I said, turning to my son one last time. Are you really going to stand there and let your wife keep your daughter in a home where she's being abused? She's not being abused, he shouted, finally showing some emotion. God, Mom, you're so dramatic. It's a haircut. Kids get haircuts. Kids don't get their heads shaved bald as punishment. I shouted back. Kids don't get razor burns on their scalps. Kids don't get told they're ugly. This is not normal, David. This is not acceptable. But I could see in his eyes that he was too far gone, too deep under Rebecca's influence, too committed to supporting his wife to admit that what they had done was wrong. He wasn't going to save his daughter. He was going to choose his marriage over his child's well-being. So I made the choice for him. I walked toward the door with Emma in my arms, and Rebecca tried to block my path. "You put her down right now, or I'm calling the police." "Call them," I said, and I meant it. "Call the police and explain to them why your daughter's head is shaved and bleeding. Explain to them why she's begging to come with me instead of staying with you. I dare you." Rebecca's face went white because she knew, deep down, that what she had done was indefensible. She knew that any reasonable person, any police officer, any social worker, would look at Emma's condition and start asking very uncomfortable questions. But she was still blocking my path, and David was standing behind her, both of them forming a wall between me and the door. The other family members just stood there watching, too cowardly to take sides, too comfortable to risk their own position by standing up for what was right. Emma was whispering in my ear, "I want to go with you, Grandma. Please take me with you. I don't want to stay here." The desperation in her voice gave me strength I didn't know I had. I looked at my son and daughter-in-law and said, "Get out of my way." "Mom, think about what you're doing," David said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "This is going to tear our family apart." "Your family is already torn apart," I told him. "It was torn apart the moment you allowed your wife to abuse your daughter. It was torn apart the moment you chose to support cruelty over protecting innocence. I'm not the one destroying this family, David. You are." And then I did something I never thought I would do in my life. I pushed past my own son, the child I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, and I walked out that door with Emma in my arms. The night air hit us like a blast of freedom, and Emma's grip on me loosened slightly. She wasn't safe yet, but she was away from them, away from the people who had hurt her and then dismissed her pain. As I buckled her into my car, she looked up at me with those big, wounded eyes and asked the question that still breaks my heart. "Grandma, am I ugly now?" I knelt down beside the car door and took her little face in my hands, feeling the roughness of her shaved scalp under my palms. "Emma, baby, you are the most beautiful child in the world. Your hair doesn't make you beautiful. Your kindness makes you beautiful. Your laughter makes you beautiful. Your big heart that loves everyone makes you beautiful. And nothing anyone does to you can ever change that." She started crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief, tears of someone who had been holding their breath underwater and finally broke the surface. "I promise you," I said, my own tears falling freely now, "I will never let anyone hurt you like this again. I will protect you no matter what it costs me. Do you believe me?" She nodded and threw her arms around my neck. "I love you, Grandma. I love you too, baby. More than you'll ever know." As I drove away from that house, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw David standing in the doorway, watching us leave. I wondered if he understood what he had just lost. I wondered if he would ever realize that he had chosen the wrong side in the most important battle of his life. If this moment doesn't break your heart, tell me why in the comments. And if it does, subscribe to this channel, because silence only protects abusers. We need to be voices for children who can't protect themselves. That first night at my house was the longest night of my life. Emma couldn't sleep, couldn't get comfortable, couldn't stop touching her head where her hair used to be. Every time she looked in a mirror, she started crying. Every time she caught her reflection in a window or the TV screen, her little face would crumple with shame. I had set up the guest room for her with fresh sheets and her favorite stuffed animal that I keep at my house for visits, but she couldn't settle down. She would lie down for a few minutes, then get up and pace around the room, then come find me in the living room where I was sitting up waiting, just in case she needed me. Around midnight, she finally fell asleep on the couch with her head in my lap, while I stroked her back and hummed the lullabies I used to sing to her when she was smaller. But even in sleep, she wasn't at peace. She kept murmuring apologies in her sleep, saying, "I'm sorry, Mommy, and I'll be good, and please don't be mad at me." Listening to my granddaughter apologize in her dreams for being abused was torture. Pure, unadulterated torture. She had been so conditioned to believe that she deserved this treatment, that she had somehow earned this humiliation, that even unconscious, her mind was still trying to appease her abuser. I sat there in the dark, holding this broken little girl, and I thought about all the signs I had missed. How many times had Emma seemed quieter than usual during visits? How many times had she flinched when Rebecca spoke to her? How many times had she asked to stay longer at my house, begged to come with me when I left? I remembered a visit about 2 months ago when Emma had asked me, completely out of nowhere, "Grandma, do you think Mommy loves me?" I had been so shocked by the question that I'd given her some generic reassurance about how all mommies love their children. I dismissed it as normal childhood insecurity instead of recognizing it as a cry for help. The guilt was eating me alive. How long had this been going on? How long had Emma been suffering while I remained oblivious? How many other disciplinary actions had I not witnessed? How many other ways had Rebecca been breaking my granddaughter's spirit while I smiled and made small talk and brought casseroles to family dinners? Around 3 a.m, my phone started ringing. David. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. By the 5th call, I was worried he might wake Emma, so I stepped outside onto my porch to answer. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was shaking with anger. "You can't just take someone's child. Bring Emma home right now or I'm calling the police." "Go ahead and call them," I said calmly. "Call the police and let them see what your wife did to your daughter. Let them ask Emma how she feels about going home to the people who shaved off her hair and told her she was ugly. You're being ridiculous. It's just a haircut. David, stop saying that." I exploded, my voice echoing in the quiet night. "Stop minimizing what happened. Your daughter was traumatized. She was humiliated. She's 8 years old and she thinks she's ugly because of what your wife did to her. Rebecca was disciplining her. Kids need discipline. Kids need love." I shouted back. "Kids need safety. Kids need to feel valued and protected. They don't need to be psychologically tortured by the people who are supposed to care for them." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, I had gotten through to him. Maybe he was finally hearing what I was saying. But when he spoke again, his voice was cold and determined. "If you don't bring Emma home by tomorrow morning, I'm filing kidnapping charges against you." "I mean it, Mom. I'll have you arrested." The threat hit me like a physical blow. My own son was threatening to have me arrested for protecting his daughter from abuse. The man I had raised, the man I had loved unconditionally for 34 years, was choosing his abusive wife over both his daughter and his mother. "Then do what you have to do," I said, my voice steady despite my breaking heart. "But Emma is not going back to a house where she's going to be hurt. I'd rather go to jail than send her back to that." I hung up the phone and stood there on my porch, shaking with rage and heartbreak and terror. Because I knew David wasn't bluffing. I knew that Rebecca would push him to follow through on his threat, and I knew that legally, I had no rights. Emma wasn't my child. I had no legal authority to keep her with me, no matter how much I loved her or how much she needed protection. But I also knew that I would rather spend the rest of my life in prison than send that little girl back to be further abused. I would rather lose everything I had than fail her again. When I went back inside, Emma was awake, sitting up on the couch with tears streaming down her face. "Grandma, was that Daddy? Does he want me to come home?" I sat down beside her and pulled her close. "What do you want, sweetheart? Do you want to go home?" She shook her head violently. "No. I want to stay here with you. I feel safe here. At home, I always feel scared that I'm going to do something wrong and make Mommy mad." The honesty in her voice, the matter-of-fact way she described living in fear, made me want to scream until my voice gave out. No child should have to say those words. No child should have to choose between home and safety because they're not the same thing. "You're going to stay here as long as you need to," I promised her. "No matter what happens, no matter what anyone says or does, you are safe with me." She curled up against my side and finally fell into a peaceful sleep. But I stayed awake, holding her and preparing for the war that I knew was coming. The pattern of abuse became crystal clear over the next few days as Emma slowly began to open up to me. What I had witnessed at that dinner table wasn't an isolated incident or a moment of poor judgment. It was the latest in a long series of psychological and emotional abuse that had been systematically breaking my granddaughter's spirit. Emma told me about other punishments that Rebecca had inflicted on her. There was the time she was made to stand in the corner for 3 hours because she spilled juice on her shirt. The time Rebecca threw away all of Emma's art projects because her room wasn't clean enough. The time she was locked in her room for an entire weekend because she forgot to feed the goldfish one morning. But the hair cutting wasn't even the first time. Emma confessed, with tears streaming down her face, that Rebecca had cut her hair short as punishment twice before, but never this severe. The first time was when Emma was 6 and had gotten mud on her school clothes playing at recess. Rebecca had cut off 8 inches, telling Emma that if she was going to act like a wild animal, she would look like one too. The second time was last year when Emma had difficulty with a math assignment and cried about it. Rebecca decided that Emma was being too emotional and dramatic, so she cut her hair to her shoulders and told her that maybe looking less pretty would help her focus on being smarter instead of vain. Each story Emma told made my blood pressure spike higher and my hands shake with fury. This woman had been systematically targeting my granddaughter's appearance, her sense of femininity, her self-esteem, using hair cutting as a weapon to control and humiliate her. "Mommy says I have ugly hair anyway," Emma said matter-of-factly as she ate breakfast on our second morning together. "She says it's too messy and too hard to take care of, and that I'm not responsible enough to have long hair like other girls." The casual way she repeated these devastating criticisms broke my heart into even smaller pieces. She had internalized her mother's cruelty, had begun to believe that she deserved this treatment, that she was somehow deficient and needed to be punished into compliance. "Emma, honey," I said, sitting down beside her at my kitchen table. "What your mommy said about your hair is not true. Your hair is beautiful and you are responsible and you don't deserve to be hurt like this. But I do forget to brush it sometimes," she said, her eyes wide and earnest. "And I get tangles, and I don't like when it gets pulled when mommy brushes it hard." "Sweetheart, every little girl gets tangles in her hair. That's normal. That's what being a kid means. Your mommy is supposed to help you learn to take care of your hair, not punish you for being 8 years old." The phone calls from David continued relentlessly. He called every few hours, alternating between threats and pleas, between anger and what sounded like desperation. Sometimes Rebecca would get on the phone, her voice dripping with fake concern as she talked about how worried she was about Emma, how she just wanted her daughter home safe. The hypocrisy was staggering. These people had traumatized a child, and now they were positioning themselves as the concerned parents worried about their daughter's well-being. They were making me the villain for removing Emma from an abusive situation. But what really made my blood boil was when David called and said, "Mom, please. Rebecca feels terrible about what happened. She wants a chance to make it right with Emma. She wants to apologize. She feels terrible. She wants to make it right." As if shaving off a child's hair and telling her she's ugly is something you can just apologize for and move on from. As if trauma works that way. As if Emma's trust and sense of safety could be restored with a simple "I'm sorry." "David," I said, my voice shaking with rage, "your wife doesn't feel terrible. If she felt terrible, she would never have done this in the first place. If she felt terrible, she would be calling CPS herself and asking for help. She's only sorry because there are consequences now, because someone finally stood up to her." "You don't know that," he said, but his voice was weak. "Maybe she really does regret it. Then why isn't she on this phone right now? Why isn't she begging Emma for forgiveness? Why isn't she asking what she can do to help Emma heal? Why is she letting you make these calls while she sits back and plays the victim?" He didn't have an answer for that because there wasn't one. Rebecca wasn't sorry. She was angry that her control had been challenged, angry that her abuse had been exposed, angry that she was facing resistance instead of compliance. Other family members started calling too. David's brother Mark called to tell me I was making things worse and that I should let the family work this out privately. Rebecca's sister called to tell me that I was overreacting and that modern discipline is different from what we grew up with. The gaslighting was incredible. They were all rallying around the abuser, minimizing the victim's pain, and making me the problem for refusing to stay silent. They wanted me to sacrifice Emma's well-being for the sake of family peace, to pretend that what I had witnessed was acceptable parenting instead of child abuse. But the call that hurt the most came from my own daughter, Sarah, David's sister. She called on the fourth day and said, "Mom, you need to bring Emma home. You're tearing this family apart." "Sarah," I said, my voice breaking, "your niece was abused. She was humiliated and traumatized. How can you ask me to send her back to that?" "It's not abuse, Mom. It's just different parenting. You're being overdramatic. Emma will be fine. Kids are resilient. Kids are resilient." The magic phrase that people use to justify ignoring children's pain. Yes, kids are resilient, but that doesn't mean we should traumatize them and expect them to just bounce back. That doesn't mean their suffering doesn't matter because they'll eventually adapt to it. "Have you talked to Emma?" I asked Sarah. "Have you seen her? Have you heard her crying in her sleep, apologizing for being abused?" "I don't need to see her to know you're overreacting," Sarah said coldly. "You always were too protective, too emotional. Maybe that's why David's marriage is struggling, because he learned from you that women should be dramatic and interfering." The betrayal I felt from my daughter was almost as devastating as David's betrayal. Sarah was throwing me under the bus to protect an abuser, was blaming me for my son's choice to support his wife's cruelty. She was making me the villain for having emotions about my granddaughter's pain. That's when I knew I was truly alone in this fight. The entire family had chosen sides, and they had chosen wrong. They had chosen comfort over courage, peace over protection, enabling over justice. Should discipline ever strip a child of dignity? Should punishment ever involve humiliation and shame? Should a child ever be made to feel ugly and worthless as a lesson? Comment yes or no below, because I need to know that there are still people in this world who understand the difference between guidance and abuse. On the morning of the fifth day, I woke up to Emma's screams. She was having another nightmare, thrashing around in the guest bed, crying and apologizing and begging someone not to hurt her. I ran to her room and found her sitting up, disoriented and terrified, her hands frantically touching her head as if she was surprised all over again to find it bare. "It's okay, baby," I said, gathering her into my arms. "You're safe. You're with Grandma. You're safe." But she was inconsolable, sobbing against my shoulder, her whole body shaking with terror. "I dreamed Mommy was cutting my hair again," she gasped between sobs. "I dreamed she said I was ugly and bad and that she was going to cut it all off again because I was crying." The fact that my granddaughter was having nightmares about her own mother, was living in terror of the woman who gave birth to her, was beyond heartbreaking. It was a level of psychological damage that I wasn't sure could ever be fully healed. I held her until the trembling stopped, until her breathing became normal again, until she was able to look at me without that glazed look of panic in her eyes. Then I made a decision that I knew would change everything. "Emma," I said, "I'm going to call someone who can help us. Someone whose job it is to protect children. Is that okay with you?" She nodded solemnly. "Will they make me go back home?" "I don't know, sweetheart. But they'll listen to what happened to you, and they'll try to make sure you're safe. That's their job, to keep children safe." "Okay," she whispered. "I trust you, Grandma. I trust you, Grandma." Those 4 words gave me the strength to do what I should have done days earlier. I called Child Protective Services. The social worker who answered the phone listened to my story with professional calm, asking pointed questions about Emma's condition, about the timeline of events, about my concerns for her safety. She scheduled a home visit for that afternoon, said she would need to interview Emma separately, and warned me that the process might be difficult for everyone involved. Are you prepared for the possibility that Emma might be returned to her parents pending investigation? She asked. No, I said honestly. I'm not prepared for that. But I'm less prepared to stay silent while she's being abused. After I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that finally, someone with authority was going to listen to Emma's story and take it seriously. Terror that I might have just set in motion a series of events that could result in Emma being returned to Rebecca's custody. But when I looked at my granddaughter, still pale and shaky from her nightmare, still unconsciously touching her bald head, I knew I had made the right choice. Whatever the consequences for me, whatever damage this did to my relationship with David, whatever chaos it brought to our family, none of that mattered as much as Emma's safety. The social worker arrived that afternoon, a middle-aged black woman named Ms. Johnson who had kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Emma at ease. She took photos of Emma's shaved head, documented the razor burns that were still visible, and asked Emma careful questions about how she felt, what had happened, whether she felt safe. Emma told her story in a small, quiet voice, occasionally looking at me for reassurance that it was okay to tell the truth. She described the hair-cutting, the name-calling, the previous punishments, the fear she felt at home. Ms. Johnson listened without judgment, took notes, and assured Emma that she was brave for speaking up. Sweetheart, Ms. Johnson said to Emma when the interview was over, no one has the right to make you feel ugly or scared. What happened to you is not okay, and it's not your fault. Do you understand that? Emma nodded, tears in her eyes. Will I have to go back there? I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're safe, Ms. Johnson promised. That's my job, and I take it very seriously. After Emma went to play in the backyard, Ms. Johnson sat down with me to discuss next steps. I'm going to need to interview the parents, she said. And I'll be recommending that Emma remain in your custody temporarily while we complete our investigation. What if they refuse to cooperate? I asked. Then things become more complicated legally. But Mrs. Margaret, I want you to know that what you've described and what I've observed today is clearly a case of emotional abuse. The severity of the haircutting, combined with Emma's emotional state and her fear of returning home, paints a very concerning picture. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Someone with authority was taking this seriously. Someone was looking at the evidence and seeing what I saw, a traumatized child who needed protection. But that hope was short-lived. Less than 2 hours after Ms. Johnson left, David showed up at my door with a police officer. The sight of my son standing on my porch with a uniformed police officer behind him was like a punch to the gut. David's face was set in hard lines, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold in a way I'd never seen before. This wasn't my little boy anymore. This was a stranger who happened to share my DNA. Ma'am, the officer said politely, I'm Officer Martinez. I understand there's a custody dispute here involving a minor child. There's no custody dispute, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. There's a child abuse situation that I reported to CPS earlier today. David's face twisted with anger. She kidnapped my daughter. She has no legal right to keep Emma here. I removed my granddaughter from an abusive situation, I corrected, looking directly at David. Something you should have done yourself instead of enabling your wife's cruelty. Officer Martinez held up his hand. Let's all take a step back here. Mr. Peterson, I understand your daughter has been staying with her grandmother for several days. Mrs. Peterson, I understand you have concerns about the child's welfare. Has CPS been contacted? Yes, I said. A social worker was here today and interviewed Emma. She's recommending that Emma remain in my custody temporarily while they investigate. David's face went red. You called CPS on us? You called strangers to interfere in our family. I called professionals to protect a child who is being abused. I shot back. I called people whose job it is to keep children safe when their own parents won't. Can I see the child? Officer Martinez asked. I need to assess her well-being and get her statement about where she wants to be. Emma had been in the backyard when they arrived, but she must have heard the raised voices because she came running to the front door. When she saw David, she stopped dead in her tracks, her face going pale, her hands immediately moving to touch her bald head. "Daddy," she said in a small voice. "Hey, baby girl," David said, his voice softening slightly. "I'm here to take you home. Grandma's visit is over now." Emma looked back and forth between David and me, confusion and fear written all over her face. "I don't want to go home," she said quietly. "I want to stay with Grandma." "Emma, you have to come home," David said, his voice getting firmer. "Mommy misses you. She wants to talk to you about what happened." "I don't want to talk to Mommy," Emma said, stepping closer to me. "She made me ugly. She said I look like a boy now." Officer Martinez knelt down to Emma's eye level. "Emma, can you tell me what happened to your hair?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Mommy cut it all off because I didn't brush it good enough. She said I look ugly now and that maybe people will think I'm sick." I watched Officer Martinez's expression change as he really looked at Emma's head for the first time, saw the extent of the shaving, saw the fear in her eyes. His professional demeanor shifted slightly, became more protective. "Emma," he said gently, "where do you feel safest right now?" "Here with Grandma," she said immediately. "I feel safe here." David started to protest, but Officer Martinez stood up and faced him. "Mr. Peterson, I need to be honest with you. What I'm seeing here is a child who appears to have been subjected to what could be considered excessive punishment and who is expressing fear about returning home. Combined with the CPS involvement, I'm not comfortable forcing her to leave this environment right now. She's my daughter." David exploded. "I have parental rights. You can't just decide that she stays here." "You're right, sir. I can't make that decision long term. But I can ensure that a child who is expressing fear isn't forced into a situation where she feels unsafe. The CPS investigation will determine the appropriate custody arrangement." The rage on David's face was frightening. This was a man who was used to getting his way, used to having control, and the fact that his authority was being questioned was making him dangerous. "This is insane," he shouted. "My mother has poisoned my daughter against us. She's filled Emma's head with lies." "I didn't have to fill her head with anything," I said coldly. "I just had to look at what your wife did to her and listen to what Emma told me about living in fear in her own home." Emma started crying again, overwhelmed by the tension and the shouting. Officer Martinez noticed immediately and made his decision. "Mr. Peterson, I'm going to recommend that you contact a family law attorney and work through the proper legal channels. Right now, this child is safe, fed, and cared for, and she's expressed a clear preference to remain here. Forcing her to leave against her will when there's an active CPS investigation would not be in anyone's best interest." David's face went through several emotions: rage, disbelief, hurt, and finally something that might have been defeat. He looked at Emma, still crying and pressed against my side, and for just a moment I saw a flicker of the sun I raised. "Emma," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "Daddy loves you. You know that, right?" Emma nodded, but didn't move away from me. "I love you too, Daddy. But I don't want to go home. I'm scared there." The admission hung in the air like a bomb. My granddaughter had just told her father that she was scared in her own home, and instead of that being a wake-up call, instead of that making him question what was happening in his house, I could see him shutting down emotionally. "We'll figure this out, Emma," he said stiffly. "Everything will be okay." But as he walked away from my porch, I knew that nothing would be okay. I knew that he was going home to Rebecca, that they would strategize together about how to get Emma back, that they would paint me as the villain and themselves as the victims. I also knew that I had just declared war on my own son, and that there would be no going back from this moment. The next few days blurred together in a haze of phone calls, paperwork, and legal consultations. David made good on his threat to contact an attorney, and suddenly I found myself needing legal representation of my own. The family court system, I learned, is not designed for situations like ours. Grandparents have very few rights, even when they're protecting grandchildren from abuse. My attorney, a sharp woman named Linda Chin who specialized in family law, was brutally honest about my chances. Legally, you're in a very precarious position, she told me during our first meeting. Without formal guardianship or custody orders, you're essentially operating on borrowed time. The parents could get a court order to have Emma returned immediately. But what about the CPS investigation? I asked. What about the evidence of abuse? CPS investigations take time, she explained. Weeks, sometimes months. And even if they substantiate abuse, that doesn't automatically give you custody rights. The court's preference is always to reunify families when possible. Reunify. I repeated, my voice rising. They want to reunify an abused child with her abusers? They want to reunify a child with parents who have completed whatever treatment or counseling is recommended to address the issues that led to the abuse, Linda corrected gently. The system believes in rehabilitation and family preservation. The system believes in family preservation. Even when the family is destroying a child's spirit, even when the child is begging not to go home, even when the evidence of abuse is written in razor burns across a bald scalp. Emma was trying to adjust to the uncertainty, but the stress was taking its toll. She had started wetting the bed again, something she hadn't done since she was 5. She was clingy and anxious, afraid to let me out of her sight for more than a few minutes. She kept asking if I was going to send her back home, if I was going to get tired of her, if she was being too much trouble. "Grandma," she said one evening as I was tucking her into bed, "are you going to get in trouble for keeping me here?" "Maybe," I said honestly. "But that's not your worry, sweetheart. That's a grown-up problem." "I don't want you to get in trouble because of me," she said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Maybe I should just go home so you don't get hurt." The fact that this 8-year-old child was worried about protecting me, was willing to sacrifice her own safety for mine, broke my heart all over again. She had been so conditioned to put everyone else's needs before her own, to minimize her own pain to avoid causing problems for others. "Emma, listen to me," I said, taking her hands in mine. "You are not responsible for protecting the adults in your life. It's our job to protect you. It's my job to keep you safe, and I'm going to do that no matter what it costs me. Do you understand?" She nodded, but I could see the worry still etched on her face. This child had been carrying burdens that no child should carry, had been made to feel responsible for adult problems and adult emotions. The phone calls from David became more aggressive and desperate as the days passed. He had hired his own attorney, who was making noise about filing emergency custody motions, about having me charged with parental interference, about painting me as an unstable old woman who was keeping a child from her loving parents. "The lawyer says we have a strong case," David told me during one particularly heated phone call. "He says grandparents who interfere with parental rights often lose access to their grandchildren permanently." "Is that what you want, Mom? Do you want to lose Emma forever?" The threat was clear. Give Emma back now or risk never seeing her again. Submit to their control or be cut out of her life completely. "David," I said, my voice shaking with exhaustion and heartbreak, "your daughter told a police officer that she's scared to go home. She told a social worker that your wife made her feel ugly. She's having nightmares and wetting the bed and apologizing in her sleep for being abused. How can you threaten me with losing her when you're the one who's already lost her by allowing this to happen?" "She's not lost to me," he shouted. "She's my daughter. She belongs with her parents. She belongs where she's safe." I shouted back. "She belongs where she's loved and valued and protected. If that's not your house, then that's not my fault." But I could hear in his voice that he was beyond reason, beyond listening, beyond considering that maybe, just maybe, his wife was the problem and not me. He had chosen his side, and he was going to fight for it no matter what it cost his daughter. The CPS investigation was moving slowly, hampered by Rebecca's refusal to cooperate and David's insistence that nothing inappropriate had happened. Ms. Johnson told me that they were interviewing teachers, neighbors, other family members, trying to build a complete picture of Emma's home environment. These cases are always difficult, she admitted during one of our phone conversations. Emotional abuse is harder to prove than physical abuse. There are no broken bones, no obvious injuries. It's about patterns of behavior, about psychological impact, about the child's emotional state. But you saw her, I said. You saw how scared she was, how she described what happened. I did, Ms. Johnson agreed. And I believe her. But believing a child and proving abuse in a court of law are two different things. We need more evidence, more documentation, more witnesses. More evidence. As if my granddaughter's trauma wasn't evidence enough. As if her fear and shame and nightmares weren't proof of what had been done to her. But then something happened that changed everything. Ms. Johnson called me on a Thursday morning with news that made my heart race. Mrs. Peterson, she said, we've received additional reports about the family. Emma's teacher called yesterday to report concerns about changes in Emma's behavior over the past several months. And a neighbor came forward to say she witnessed what she described as concerning interactions between Rebecca and Emma in their backyard. Additional reports. Other people had seen what was happening and had finally found the courage to speak up. Emma's teacher had noticed changes in her behavior, her grades, her social interactions. A neighbor had seen Rebecca screaming at Emma, had seen Emma cowering in fear. What does this mean for Emma? I asked. It means we have corroborating evidence, Ms. Johnson said. It means Emma's account is being supported by independent witnesses. It strengthens our case significantly. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of real hope. Emma's truth was being validated by other adults, other people who had seen the pattern of abuse and had finally decided to break their silence. But I also knew that Rebecca and David wouldn't go down without a fight. I knew that they would escalate their efforts to get Emma back, would become more desperate and more dangerous as their control slipped away. I was right. The very next morning, David showed up at my door with more than just a police officer. This time, he had his attorney, a process server, and what looked like a court order. The war for Emma's soul was about to become a legal battle that would test everything I believed about justice, family, and the price of protecting innocence. Standing on my porch at 7 in the morning, facing my son and his legal team, I felt like David facing Goliath, except in this version, Goliath was my own child, and the stones in my sling were nothing but an old woman's love and desperate determination. The process server handed me papers with an official court seal. Mrs. Margaret Peterson, you're being served with an emergency motion for return of minor child and a restraining order requiring you to cease all contact with the minor child pending resolution of custody matters. The words hit me like physical blows. Not only were they demanding Emma back immediately, but they were trying to prevent me from having any contact with her at all. They weren't just trying to return her to an abusive situation. They were trying to cut off her only lifeline, her only source of safety and unconditional love. You can't be serious, I said, my voice barely a whisper as I scanned the legal documents. David's attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, stepped forward. Mrs. Peterson, my clients have been more than patient with this situation. They've tried to resolve this matter amicably, but you've forced them to seek legal remedies. The child needs to be returned to her parents immediately. The child has a name, I said, my voice gaining strength. Her name is Emma, and she's terrified to go back to people who abused her. Alleged abuse, the attorney corrected smoothly. Unsubstantiated allegations made by a child who has clearly been coached and manipulated. Coached and manipulated. They were claiming that I had somehow brainwashed Emma into lying about her own abuse, that her fear and trauma were fabricated, that her tears and nightmares were performance art orchestrated by me. Where is Emma? David asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. I want to see my daughter. Emma had heard the commotion and was standing in my living room doorway, still in her pajamas, her eyes wide with terror. When she saw David and the group of strangers on the porch, she started backing away, shaking her head. No, she said, her voice rising to near panic. No, I don't want to go. Grandma, don't let them take me. Please don't let them take me. The raw terror in her voice should have been enough to stop any reasonable person, should have made David question what he was doing. Instead, he pushed past me into my house. Emma, baby, it's okay, he said, reaching for her. Daddy's here to take you home. Emma bolted. She ran toward the back of the house, screaming, I don't want to go home. I want to stay with Grandma. Please don't make me go back there. The sound of my granddaughter's desperate screams as she tried to escape her own father was like listening to my heart being ripped out with bare hands. This was not a child who was being manipulated or coached. This was a child in genuine terror, a child whose flight response had been triggered by the prospect of returning to her abusers. David found her hiding in the guest room closet, curled up in a ball, sobbing uncontrollably. Emma, what's wrong with you? He said, frustration clear in his voice. Why are you acting like this? Because I'm scared, she wailed. Because Mommy will be mad at me for staying here. Because she'll punish me again. She's not going to punish you, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Everything is going to be fine. No, it's not. Emma screamed. She'll cut my hair again. She'll tell me I'm ugly again. She'll lock me in my room again. David's attorney was taking notes, probably planning to use Emma's emotional state as evidence that I had traumatized her, that her hysteria was proof of my negative influence rather than her legitimate fear of returning to abuse. Mr. Peterson, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, look at your daughter. Really look at her. This is not the reaction of a child who wants to go home. This is not the reaction of a child who feels safe with her parents. But David's face had hardened again. Whatever flicker of doubt he might have felt was being overridden by his loyalty to Rebecca and his need to maintain the fiction that their family was normal and healthy. She's been turned against us, he said firmly. You filled her head with lies and made her afraid of her own mother. I didn't have to fill her head with anything, I said, my composure finally cracking. All I had to do was look at her bald, bleeding scalp and listen to her cry. All I had to do was hold her while she had nightmares about being hurt by the woman who gave birth to her. The attorney stepped between us. Mrs. Peterson, you have two choices. You can turn the child over voluntarily right now, or we can have the sheriff's department execute the court order forcibly. Either way, the child is coming with us today. The sheriff's department. They were threatening to have law enforcement officers drag a terrified 8-year-old out of the only place she felt safe. They were willing to traumatize her further, to add more psychological damage to what had already been done, just to maintain their control over her. Please, I said, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I was begging. Please just look at her. Listen to her. She's telling you she's scared. She's telling you she doesn't feel safe. How can you ignore that? But they were beyond listening, beyond reason, beyond caring about Emma's emotional state. They had legal papers, they had authority, and they were going to use both to take my granddaughter back to the people who had hurt her. Emma must have realized what was happening because her sobs became even more desperate. Grandma, she screamed from the closet. Grandma, help me. Don't let them take me. Please don't let them take me. In that moment, I made a decision that probably sealed my fate legally, but saved what was left of my soul. I went to Emma, knelt down beside the closet, and took her shaking hands in mine. Emma, baby, listen to me, I said, my own tears falling freely now. They're making me let you go with your daddy right now. But this isn't over. I'm going to keep fighting for you. I'm going to keep trying to protect you. Do you believe me? She nodded, gasping for breath between sobs. I want you to remember something, I continued. You are not ugly. You are not bad. You did nothing wrong. What happened to you is not your fault, and you don't deserve to be hurt. Can you remember that for me? I'll try, she whispered. And if anything happens, if you need help, if you're scared, you find a way to call me or call Ms. Johnson from CPS or call 911. You don't have to protect the people who hurt you. Do you understand? She nodded again, and I pulled her out of the closet and into my arms for what I thought might be the last time. The feel of her small body against mine, the way she clung to me like I was her anchor in a storm, the desperate way she whispered, "I love you, Grandma," those sensations are burned into my memory forever. David's attorney was tapping his foot impatiently. "Mrs. Peterson, we need to go. Now." I looked at my son one last time, searching his face for any sign of the man I had raised, any hint of paternal instinct that might make him reconsider what he was doing. "David," I said quietly, "you're making the biggest mistake of your life. And Emma is going to pay the price for it." But his face remained hard, unmoved, convinced of his own righteousness. He reached for Emma, and she shrank away from him, but she was too exhausted from crying to fight anymore. As they carried my granddaughter out of my house, not walking, not holding hands, but actually carrying her because she was too limp with despair to walk, I stood on my porch and watched the most important person in my world disappear into a car that was taking her back to hell. The silence that followed was deafening. My house, which had been filled with Emma's presence for over a week, felt like a tomb. Her drawings were still on my refrigerator. Her favorite cup was still in my dishwasher. Her stuffed animal was still on the guest bed where she had been sleeping safely just hours before. But Emma was gone, taken back to the people who had shaved her head and told her she was ugly, and I was legally powerless to stop it. That afternoon, I received a call from Ms. Johnson. Her voice was tight with professional frustration and personal anger. "Mrs. Peterson, I'm so sorry. We tried to intervene, tried to argue that removing Emma from your custody was not in her best interest given the ongoing investigation, but the emergency court order took precedence." "What happens now?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Now we continue our investigation, and we hope that Emma is safe while we gather more evidence. And Mrs. Peterson, if anything else happens to Emma, if there are any new incidents, call me immediately. The court order doesn't prevent you from reporting suspected abuse. If anything else happens to Emma." The implication was clear. Ms. Johnson expected that something else would happen, that returning Emma to that house was like throwing a lamb back to wolves. That night, I sat in my empty house and wondered what Emma was doing, whether she was crying, whether she was afraid, whether she understood that I hadn't abandoned her by choice. I wondered if she was sleeping in her own bed or if Rebecca had already found new ways to punish her for the week she had spent with me. I thought about calling, but the restraining order prevented any contact. I thought about driving by their house, but that would only make things worse legally. I was trapped, helpless, forced to wait and hope and pray that my granddaughter would survive whatever was happening to her. But I wasn't giving up. Not by a long shot. They might have won this battle, but the war for Emma's safety was far from over. The next 3 weeks were the longest of my life. Every day felt like a year, every hour like a lifetime of wondering and worrying and imagining the worst. The restraining order meant I couldn't call Emma, couldn't see her, couldn't even drive past her school to catch a glimpse of her. I was cut off completely from the most important person in my world. My attorney, Linda Chin, was working frantically to file countermotions, to challenge the emergency custody order, to present evidence of abuse to the court. But the legal system moves like molasses, especially when a child's safety hangs in the balance. Every day that passed was another day that Emma was trapped in that house with people who had already proven they were willing to hurt her. The system is designed to protect parental rights, Linda explained during one of our meetings. It assumes that parents love their children and want what's best for them. It's not equipped to handle situations where the parents are the danger. I had started documenting everything, printing out photos of Emma's shaved head, writing down every conversation we'd had about the abuse, organizing all the evidence of Rebecca's pattern of psychological torture. I was building a case, piece by piece, preparing for the legal battle that would determine whether Emma would ever be safe. But late at night, alone in my house, the evidence and legal strategies felt cold and inadequate compared to the reality of what my granddaughter was enduring. I kept imagining her lying in her bed, touching her growing out hair, remembering the feeling of safety she'd had at my house and wondering why I had let them take her away. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after Emma had been taken from me. It was Ms. Johnson, and the urgency in her voice made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Peterson, we need you to come to the hospital immediately. Emma's at Children's Medical Center." "She's okay," she added quickly, hearing my sharp intake of breath, "but there's been an incident." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. "What kind of incident? What happened to her?" "I can't give you details over the phone, but Emma asked for you specifically. The hospital staff is allowing you to see her despite the restraining order because she's in distress and you're her emergency contact." I was in my car and driving before Ms. Johnson had even finished explaining the hospital's visiting policies. My mind was racing with horrible possibilities. Had Rebecca hurt her again? Had David finally seen his wife's true nature and tried to intervene? Had Emma hurt herself because she couldn't take any more abuse? The drive to the hospital was a blur of traffic lights and terror. I kept thinking about the last time I'd seen Emma, how she'd clung to me and begged me not to let them take her. I had failed her then, had been powerless to protect her, and now something had happened that was serious enough to land her in the hospital. When I arrived at the children's ward, I found Ms. Johnson waiting for me with a police officer and a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be the hospital's social worker. Their faces were grim, professional, but I could see anger simmering beneath their controlled expressions. "Mrs. Peterson," Ms. Johnson said, "before you see Emma, we need to prepare you for what you're going to find. She's been admitted for severe malnutrition and dehydration. She weighs 8 pounds less than she did 3 weeks ago when she was in your custody." 8 pounds. An 8-year-old child had lost 8 pounds in 3 weeks. That wasn't normal weight loss. That was starvation. They weren't feeding her? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Emma says she was being given 1 meal a day and only water to drink," the police officer said, consulting his notes. "She says it was punishment for the embarrassment she caused the family by staying with you." Punishment for the embarrassment she caused. They had starved my granddaughter because she had sought safety with me, because she had told the truth about being abused, because she had dared to resist their control. She was found this morning by her teacher, who noticed that she was lethargic and disoriented in class, Ms. Johnson continued. When the school nurse examined her, they found that she was severely dehydrated and malnourished. They called an ambulance immediately. "Where are David and Rebecca now?" I asked, rage building in my chest like a volcano about to erupt. "They're being questioned by police," the officer said. "Both parents claim that Emma was eating normally, that they have no idea why she would be malnourished. They're suggesting that she has some kind of eating disorder." An eating disorder. They were going to blame an 8-year-old child for her own starvation, were going to claim that she had somehow chosen not to eat rather than admit that they had withheld food as punishment. "Can I see her now?" I asked, because nothing else mattered except getting to Emma. They led me down a corridor lined with cheerful children's artwork and into a room where my granddaughter was lying in a hospital bed, looking impossibly small and fragile. She was connected to N4, getting fluids and nutrients pumped into her dehydrated body. Her hair had grown out slightly in the 3 weeks we'd been apart, but it was still patchy and uneven. When she saw me, her face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in weeks. "Grandma," she said, trying to sit up. "You came. I knew you would come." I rushed to her bedside and gathered her into my arms, feeling how much thinner she was, how her bones seemed to stick out in places where there used to be healthy child roundness. She was so light, so fragile, like holding a baby bird with broken wings. "I'm here, sweetheart," I whispered into her hair. "Grandma's here, and I'm never going to let anyone hurt you again." I tried to be good, she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "I tried so hard to be good so they wouldn't be mad at me for staying with you. But Mommy said I had to learn what happens when I embarrass the family. She had to learn what happens when she embarrasses the family. By being starved." By being treated like a prisoner in her own home. By being punished for seeking safety. Emma, baby, you didn't do anything wrong, I said, stroking her back and feeling the sharp edges of her shoulder blades. You didn't embarrass anyone. You were protecting yourself, and that was exactly the right thing to do. Mommy said you didn't really love me, Emma continued, and each word was like a knife in my heart. She said if you really loved me, you wouldn't have called strangers to take me away from my family. She said you were just pretending to care about me. The psychological warfare that Rebecca had waged against Emma in my absence was breathtaking in its cruelty. She had used my granddaughter's love for me as a weapon, had twisted my efforts to protect Emma into evidence that I didn't care about her. Emma, look at me, I said, gently lifting her chin so she could see my face. I love you more than anything in this world. I called those people because I wanted to keep you safe, not because I wanted to hurt you. Everything I've done has been because I love you. She nodded, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. I know, Grandma. I knew Mommy was lying. But it hurt anyway. Of course it hurt. She was 8 years old, and the woman who was supposed to love and protect her was using psychological torture to break her spirit. She was being punished for my love, being starved because she had dared to accept protection from someone who truly cared about her. Ms. Johnson appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Peterson, I need to update you on the legal situation. Based on Emma's condition and her account of what's been happening at home, we're filing for emergency removal. She won't be going back to that house. What about David and Rebecca? I asked. They're going to be charged with child abuse and neglect. The evidence is overwhelming this time. Medical documentation, witness statements from the school staff, Emma's own testimony. There's no way they can explain this away. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly. Emma was safe. She was not going back to that house. The people who had hurt her were finally going to face consequences for their actions. But even as relief flooded through me, I knew that this was just the beginning. Emma would need therapy, medical care, time to heal from both the physical and psychological damage that had been done to her. And legally, I still had no guarantee that I would be allowed to care for her long term. Grandma, Emma said quietly, can I stay with you now? I promise I'll be good. I promise I won't cause any more problems. The fact that she was still trying to earn love and safety, still believing that she had somehow caused these problems, showed how deeply the abuse had affected her sense of self-worth. Emma, you're going to stay with me for as long as you want to, I promised her. And you don't have to be good to earn that. You don't have to earn my love. It's yours no matter what, forever and always. She fell asleep in my arms while the four continued to pump life back into her starved body. As I held her, I thought about David, about the man I had raised and loved, about the choices he had made that led to his daughter being hospitalized for malnutrition. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, no joy in Rebecca's impending arrest. I felt only grief for the family we had been, for the relationships that were now forever broken, for the innocence that had been stolen from my granddaughter. But I also felt something else, a fierce determination to make sure that Emma's voice was finally heard, that her truth was finally acknowledged, that her safety was finally prioritized over family preservation and parental rights. The war was far from over, but for the first time, we were winning. The months that followed Emma's hospitalization were a blur of court hearings, therapy appointments, and the slow, careful work of helping a traumatized child learn to trust the world again. David and Rebecca were both arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse and neglect. The media picked up the story, grandmother's fight to save granddaughter from abuse, and suddenly our private hell became public knowledge. The legal proceedings were brutal. Rebecca's attorney tried to paint her as a devoted mother who had simply used unconventional discipline methods. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about cultural differences in parenting, about the stress of modern motherhood, about how emotional abuse was subjective and hard to define. David's attorney took a different approach, portraying him as a loving father who had been misled by his wife, who hadn't realized the extent of what was happening to Emma. They painted him as another victim of Rebecca's manipulation, a man who had been torn between loyalty to his wife and love for his daughter. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emma's medical records, the photos of her shaved head, the testimony from teachers and neighbors, the documentation of her weight loss and malnutrition, it painted a picture of systematic abuse that no amount of legal maneuvering could excuse. Emma herself had to testify, had to sit in a courtroom and tell strangers about the most traumatic experiences of her young life. I held her hand as she described the haircutting, the starvation, the psychological torture she had endured. Her voice was small but clear, her words devastating in their simple honesty. "Mommy said I was ugly," she told the judge. "She said I looked like a boy and that people would think I was sick. She said it was my fault for not taking care of my hair properly." The judge, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, listened to every word with visible distress. When Emma described being given only one meal a day as punishment for staying with me, I saw the judge's hands clench into fists. "Emma," the judge said gently, "do you feel safe with your grandmother?" "Yes," Emma said without hesitation. "Grandma makes me feel safe. She tells me I'm beautiful even when my hair is messy. She never makes me feel ugly or bad." Rebecca's conviction was swift and decisive. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison for child abuse, with the possibility of parole in 3 years if she completed extensive psychological counseling. David received a suspended sentence and 3 years of supervised probation, along with mandatory parenting classes and therapy. But the legal victory felt hollow compared to the ongoing work of helping Emma heal. She had nightmares for months, would wake up screaming and touching her head, convinced that someone was cutting her hair again. She hoarded food in her bedroom, terrified that meals would be taken away from her as punishment. The therapist we found, Dr. Sarah Martinez, specialized in childhood trauma and abuse recovery. She explained to me that Emma's healing would be a long process, that the psychological damage done to her would take years to fully address. Children who have been subjected to this kind of systematic emotional abuse often struggle with self-worth issues for years, Dr. Martinez explained. Emma has been conditioned to believe that love is conditional, that she has to earn safety and affection through perfect behavior. Unlearning those patterns takes time and patience. I was prepared to give Emma all the time and patience she needed. I was prepared to wake up with her during nightmares, to reassure her that food would always be available, to tell her she was beautiful and loved every single day until she finally believed it. Slowly, gradually, I began to see glimpses of the child Emma had been before the abuse. Her hair grew back, thick and beautiful and auburn like her mother's used to be. She started laughing again, started playing with other children, started believing that she was worthy of love and kindness. The custody hearing that would determine Emma's permanent placement was scheduled for 6 months after her removal from David and Rebecca's home. By then, Emma had gained back the weight she'd lost and more. She was thriving in school, had made friends, was slowly learning to trust again. But I knew that the court system's preference for family reunification meant that David might still be granted custody, that Emma might be forced to live with a man who had chosen his abusive wife over his daughter's safety. The night before the custody hearing, Emma crawled into my bed, something she did when she was particularly anxious or scared. "Grandma," she said quietly, "what if the judge makes me go live with Daddy again?" "That's not going to happen," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. "But if it did, if something crazy happened and you had to go somewhere else, you would still be my granddaughter. You would still be loved. And I would still fight for you every single day." "Promise?" she asked. "Promise," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. The custody hearing was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The courtroom was packed with social workers, attorneys, court officials, and media representatives. Emma's guardian ad litem, a lawyer appointed to represent her interests, had prepared a comprehensive report recommending that I be granted permanent custody. David took the stand to testify on his own behalf, and I barely recognized the man who had once been my son. He looked older, hollow, broken by the consequences of his choices. He testified that he had learned from his mistakes, that he was committed to protecting Emma, that he deserved a chance to rebuild their relationship. But when Emma's attorney asked him directly if your wife were released from prison tomorrow and wanted to resume her relationship with Emma, what would you do? David hesitated for too long before answering. I would have to consider what was best for everyone involved, he said finally. Everyone involved. Not what was best for Emma, not what would keep her safe, but what was best for everyone, including the woman who had abused his daughter. The judge didn't hesitate. Based on the evidence presented, the testimony of the child, and the recommendations of all court-appointed officials, I am granting permanent custody to Margaret Peterson. The child will remain in her grandmother's care, where she has demonstrated significant improvement in all areas of functioning. Emma burst into tears of relief and threw herself into my arms. I get to stay with you forever, Grandma. Forever and always, I promised her. David's face crumpled when the judge announced her decision. For just a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be, the child who had once loved me unconditionally. But that moment passed, and he walked out of the courtroom without looking back, without saying goodbye to his daughter, without acknowledging the choice he had made. As I speak these words to you now, 6 months after that custody hearing, Emma is a different child than the terrified, bald little girl I first held in my arms at that dinner table. She's 9 years old now, with hair that reaches her shoulders and eyes that light up when she laughs. She still has hard days, still occasionally has nightmares, still sometimes hoards food when she's stressed. But she's healing. We've never heard from David again. He chose not to exercise his visitation rights, chose to walk away from his daughter rather than fight for her or acknowledge his failures. Rebecca is still in prison, and according to the conditions of her sentence, she will not be allowed unsupervised contact with Emma even after her release. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the choices I made, if I think I was too harsh, if I wish I had tried harder to preserve the family. The answer is always the same. I regret nothing. I regret not seeing the signs sooner. I regret not acting faster. I regret every day that Emma suffered while I remained blind to her pain. But I do not regret standing up for her, fighting for her, choosing her safety over family peace. Emma is in therapy, where she's learning that her worth is not conditional, that love doesn't have to be earned, that safety is a right, not a privilege. She's learning to trust her own voice, to speak up when something doesn't feel right, to believe that she deserves protection and kindness. She draws pictures now of families, not the twisted, painful version she lived with, but healthy families where children are cherished and protected. She draws herself with long, beautiful hair and a big smile. She draws herself as safe. I think about all the children who are suffering right now in homes where abuse is called discipline, where cruelty is disguised as love, where speaking up means punishment and staying silent means survival. I think about all the grandparents and relatives and neighbors who see signs of abuse, but choose not to get involved, who value peace over protection. Emma's story could have ended differently. She could have learned to accept abuse as normal, could have grown up believing she was worthless, could have repeated the cycle with her own children someday. Instead, she's learning that she has value, that she deserves love, that there are adults who will fight for her no matter what it costs. To everyone listening to this story, I want you to ask yourself, what would you have done if this was your granddaughter? Would you have stayed silent to keep peace in the family? Would you have minimized the abuse to avoid conflict? Or would you have stood up and fought regardless of the consequences? Because somewhere in your neighborhood, in your family, in your community, there's a child who needs someone to see their pain and take action. There's a child who needs someone to value their safety more than family harmony, their well-being more than keeping secrets. Emma was saved because someone finally listened to her, finally believed her, finally chose her over the adults who were hurting her. Every child deserves that kind of protection. Every child deserves someone who will fight for them when they can't fight for themselves. If you can watch this story, if you can hear Emma's pain and my heartbreak and the devastating choices that had to be made, and not subscribe to this channel, then be honest in the comments. Why turn away from truth when it's right here? Why choose silence when children are suffering? Why protect abusers when victims need voices? Subscribe if you believe every child deserves protection. Share this story if you think Emma's voice matters. Comment if you're ready to be someone who stands up instead of staying silent. Because in the end, that's all it takes to save a child. One person who refuses to look away. One person who chooses courage over comfort. One person who decides that protecting innocence is worth any price. Emma is safe now. She's loved, she's healing, and she knows that she has value. But there are thousands of other children out there who are still waiting for someone to see them, to hear them, to fight for them. Don't be the person who looks away. Be the person who stands up. Be the voice for the voiceless. Be the protector of the innocent. Because every child deserves what Emma has now: safety, love, and the knowledge that they matter more than anything else in the world. Thank you for listening to our story. Thank you for bearing witness to Emma's pain and her healing. Thank you for believing that children matter, that their voices deserve to be heard, that their safety is worth fighting for. Now go out there and be someone's hero. Because somewhere, a child is waiting for you to save them.